Okay, thanks, Joe. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for coming to the session. Really pleased to be able to speak to a network like this about the review that John and I have done and the implications of this more widely. So yeah, really pleased to be here today. Hopefully you should all be able to see my slides, as well as the recording. I'm happy to share a copy of the slides, or feel free to email me afterwards as well if you want to get in touch, or John. I'm sure we'll be very happy for you to get in touch, and there'll be some details on the screen further on in the presentation. So there's a few elements about the presentation today. Can I just check that everyone can hear me okay? So if you can't, just maybe let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that everyone can hear me okay. Okay, good. I'm not hearing anyone say no. So, and I can see a thumbs up from Vicky. Great, thanks, Vicky. That's very helpful. Yeah, so we've got a couple of things that we're going to do. So I'll talk through the review, and in the paper that we've got published that's based on the review, we also go into the sort of implications in a bit more detail in terms of applying the findings. And John's going to talk through a few slides on that element, which is an area in the paper that he kind of worked a bit more on, and I'm going to cover more of the review findings and the background for the review. So you can see quite a few logos on the first slide there. So I will talk a little bit, just give a bit of background about the funding for the review, but I won't go on too much about that. So one of the logos actually that is there is the Courage Wellbeing Project, which was a project that was run at UEA to try and specifically address postgraduate researchers' mental health and well-being, and the review was very much driven by a desire to try and inform what was being done at UEA by the latest sort of evidence that was out there about how we try and sort of improve PhD researchers' well-being. So the impetus for the review was very much practice focused as well as research focused. I imagine quite a few of the people who are joining today know a bit about the literature, both the academic literature and the more sort of grey literature, government reports from people like RAND, for example, looking into the well-being of early career researchers, postgraduate researchers and PhD researchers. There is now quite a lot of literature on mental health and well-being amongst this population. And you can see a lot of these examples here are relatively recent. So 2018, I just added another one very recently. So the paper in the middle, bottom of the screen, positive factors related to graduate student mental health. That's from this year. So it's actually quite a large field now, but it's growing, and it keeps on kind of growing. So there's a real interest in trying to address this. And the Levesque paper, Levesque et al. Paper, which some of you might be familiar with, which is from 2017, I think that's approaching around 900 citations now, or something like that. And that's kind of a key piece that's really looked at some of the issues around PGR wellbeing. So there's quite a large literature, both within the academic field, but also more generally in the grey literature. And you can see at UEA we had a report that came before the Courage Project, looking at some of the issues that postgraduate researchers were facing. So in some ways it may seem that actually this is quite a well-developed field. Do we need a review? Well, our understanding of the field was that yes, there's actually quite a lot known about some of the factors influencing PGR well-being, but there isn't that much around how we try and intervene to improve it, or try and change the way we deliver supervision potentially, or change the way we support PhD researchers outside of their degree program. So although there's a lot of research on trying to understand what might be influencing well-being, there isn't so much around how we might successfully or not address mental health and well-being. And so in the first part of the paper, we just review a bit of this literature, and there are some references here that link to some of the factors that I identified. So there is to some extent a normalization of a PhD as a stressful experience. You've got to sort of suffer through your PhD, which isn't necessarily helpful, because one, it sets up expectations about the PhD experience, but it might also set up expectations about your career in academia more generally, that it's one of struggle and strain, and this is sort of normality. So this can be quite damaging. Obviously, supervisory relationships are really important, and they're highly variable. Some can be very good, and some students can have very poor experiences, but they can be really important in terms of affecting wellbeing, but they might not be all the time. Financial concerns, there are lots of different funding models around PhD, PGR study. This can have a significant effect as well. The extent of control, PGR researchers theoretically are very independent and have lots of control over their workload, but sometimes the pressure to sort of say yes to lots of different things. They might be doing teaching, they might be delivering conference presentations, they might be working on a paper, but they've also got to carry out their research and get it done. And they may not necessarily have had a chance to develop the skills to kind of manage workload or control that particularly well. There can be issues with harassment, and cultural differences and ethnic background can be important here. Professional development, career progression. This is a kind of key aspect of your PhD study, your PGR experience. But again, it can be quite variable as to what PhD students do and what they're offered. It might depend partly on their funding and their access to some of these opportunities. Obviously, the rate at which they're actually getting their research done can be a major source of stress. So if there's a problem with field work, and obviously the last couple of years where COVID has really been problematic for a lot of PhD students who've been doing their field work, this can really hamper your research progress, which might also then have knock-on effects for your funding, etc. But also there's this area of academic identity. So the kind of imposter syndrome is quite a common feeling amongst academics, but particularly early career PGR researchers. Do they feel up to the task of being an academic? Do they fit in with a department? Often, and definitely when I was doing my PhD, you might feel like you're doing your PhD in a department that doesn't necessarily fit with your research interest, because your research interest can be very particular. So there can be this sense of not fitting in, basically, and what is my academic identity, and sort of trade-offs to pursue your career with what you might really be sort of interested in. And then there are kind of all sorts of individual factors that might be going on sort of outside of the PhD. People's personalities make a difference, their family situations, all sorts of other things. So there's quite a wide understanding of how different factors might impact on PGR wellbeing. But this wasn't so much the focus of our review. As I say, although it's an area that's quite large and growing, PGR experiences are still relatively under-researched compared to the student population as a whole. There's a big focus on student well-being more generally, but within that, PhD students are a very particular population that have unique challenges and particular circumstances. The focus on research traditionally has been much greater on dropout and PhD success rather than well-being, and the link between well-being and progress and dropout or dropout is not really well researched. And although you can see a parallel with a lot of my research outside of this piece of work is focused on well-being in the workplace more widely, and there's a good deal of research around the links between productivity and well-being. But sometimes the pursuit of well-being within the workplace, for example, can be with the end of productivity in mind, and there's a danger in a way that that balance between productivity and well-being can be problematic. But as I say, it's not widely researched, the link between the two in PhD students, but obviously how you feel and whether you're having mental health problems when you're going through your period of study is going to have a massive impact on your ability to complete and how well you complete that PhD. Maybe getting research papers out at the same time, or doing other things that allow you to progress in your career afterwards. So there is awareness and there's some understanding of the issues around PGR, mental health and well-being, but very little evidence about what might effectively actually address this. So that was really what we set out to do with the review. Just to say a little bit more about what we mean by mental health and well-being, because I've talked without defining this so far. We used both the terms when we were developing our research questions and developing our search terms for the review. The literature tends to use these terms quite interchangeably as well. But it's fair to say that well-being is a much broader term, and mental health issues impact a sort of smaller subset of the population, but maybe more sort of serious. In trying to improve well-being is sort of relevant for everybody, but trying to address mental health issues might not be relevant for everybody. But the World Health Organization has a definition that sees these two areas as overlapping. So we followed that sort of conceptualization of well-being in the review because we expected to find papers that were likely to be relevant to us in terms of understanding what works, that maybe talked about mental health or well-being and all well-being. So we use both terms, but just to say there is a distinction to be made between well-being and mental health, but we were interested in both really for the review. So this is our research question. We wanted to try and find out what really what had been tested in terms of interventions for PGR students, but also less formalized interventions, but practices that might have been reported on as being effective, or institutional arrangements that might be helpful for students' mental health and their well-being. So we didn't limit the review to what we would call intervention literature, so things that were expressly sort of tested as a well-being intervention. But we also sought to try and pick up reviews that identified highlighted practices that were beneficial to well-being, but may not be formalized as an intervention in inverted commas. So that's the reason for the framing of the research question and the paper more generally. We had a wider focus than just interventions. And that's partly because we expected that literature to be very small, but also we didn't want to miss studies that were reporting relevant things. Because the review was aimed at informing the Courage Project UEA, which had lots of different strands, and John, who was the lead for that project, would be able to talk in much more detail about the Courage Project because he had a much more wider view than I do of the project and what was going on within it. But we took a rapid review approach because we wanted to arrive at the findings relatively quickly so they could inform the other strands of the Courage Project. The rapidness of the review didn't necessarily match the rapidness of getting it published, but as I'm sure those of you who are involved in publishing academic work will understand that process is not always as quick as we might like. But having said it was a rapid review, we essentially followed systematic review methods. I've been involved in a number of systematic reviews over the last 7 years or so. First came to UEA to work with the What Works Wellbeing Centre. That was a centre set up to try and discover what is effective for supporting wellbeing first by carrying out a number of reviews. So we applied this kind of methodology. It's systematic, it's rigorous, but it's also streamlined, and then we synthesize the findings, try and provide evidence of what is effective or not, so what works, but also try and identify gaps in knowledge and then make some practical implications about what we might do with this knowledge and how we have it. And that's really what the paper tries to do. So very happy to send a copy of that on to anyone who wants to read the full paper. So I won't go in detail through the process of systematic review. If someone's got questions about the methodology, then please do ask me. But essentially it involves developing a set of search terms based on your research question, and then putting them into different research databases and identifying articles that are likely to be relevant. So that's the first stage of this flow chart. These were initially completed in 2018. That identified around about 1,700 studies. Once we removed the duplicates and non-peer reviewed studies, we also excluded those published before 1990, just because we thought the research environment has changed so much since then. You know, we could arguably have excluded everything before 2000, but because we didn't have lots of studies, we wanted to sort of give maximum opportunity for finding relevant studies. John and I then screened, so we double checked each other's screening. We screened the titles, excluded more studies, then we screened abstracts, excluded more studies, and then we looked at full papers. And you can see that left us with actually a very small amount of studies. So we only had 10 papers in the initial screening process. We did identify a further 7 studies that were identified from experts within the group at UEA who are working on the Courage Project. And then, as I say, because the field of research is expanding rapidly, we updated the researchers a year later, and we had identified a further 4 studies, which doesn't seem like many studies, but when you think we only started with 10 initially, you can see that this is really an expanding area of research. So in total, then we had 21 studies. We did also do some searches of relevant websites where we thought we might find research and reports that could be relevant. we actually didn't really turn up any studies that were of sufficient quality to include in the review. So we did have a quality appraisal tool as part of the methods as well, to try and report on the quality of the different findings, the different studies we included. So, and I'll give a bit of a summary of that as I give an overview of the studies that we found. So in all, we had 21 studies, and as you can see from the number of students within those studies, a lot of these were quite small samples. This is not unexpected because a PGR community within a department and within a university is a relatively small population in comparison to, say, staff or students more generally. So it's actually quite difficult or unusual, shall I say, for studies assessing PGR, particularly interventions for PGR wellbeing, to have a large sample. There are some studies, some of the ones that I mentioned at the start of the presentation, that have quite a large sample, but they more give you a picture of, you know, well-being and maybe factors that are influencing it. There isn't a large population from which to sort of evaluate a particular practice or intervention that students have experienced. But there are a few studies that do this. So as well as students, we also had within that sample staff members, so predominantly supervisors, but also graduates of PGR studies, so people who'd completed their study and then were reflecting back on that and reporting on their experience or their experience of a supervisory technique or a different kind of interventional practice. Lots of qualitative or mixed method studies. We didn't limit the review just to quantitative studies because we would have had a really small sample. Lots of qualitative studies, as you might imagine, because either PGR students themselves or supervisors are drawing on their own experiences to some extent to report about what is effective in supporting their mental health or well-being. So it makes sense that we would have some more of these kind of autoethnographic qualitative studies that are really quite helpful actually in trying to sort of understand what might be behind supporting well-being. And then some quantitative studies and mixed method studies that apply a mixture of methods, predominantly cross-sectional or, as I say, looking back with graduate students, so not longitudinal studies. So that means that from a kind of confidence in our findings point of view, this is really quite low because we have a small number of studies. The studies tend to be studies that you can't generalize from because they're qualitative or they have small samples, and they're cross-sectional. So we don't have, you know, an attempt to try and measure somebody's mental health or their well-being before introducing a practice or an intervention and then attempt to measure it afterwards. So to have that kind of before and after measurement. So we don't have that longitudinal element. So quite limited confidence in some of the findings, but as you see, hopefully still quite a useful review in informing what we might do. So the way we tried to synthesize those findings is, and this, so we tried to produce a model of the things that might support PGR wellbeing. So this is not meant to be a comprehensive model. So this is not meant to represent all of the things that might be influential or important for PhD students' wellbeing. And as you could probably tell, because it doesn't tally with that list of factors that I presented at the start. But this is really a synthesis of what we found in the reviews, in the studies that we captured in the review. And we sort of grouped the ways in which practices, interventions might support PGR wellbeing into 4 areas. That's not necessary to say that these areas are kind of discrete. And so we've got this sort of dotted line going around the model that connects these areas because there is a sort of a dialogue between them. So I'll talk in more detail about each area on the next few slides, and I'll come back to the model at the end of it. Okay, so as I said at the start, supervisory relationship, it can be really important, and students' experiences are very variable. And within this, we found different kinds of interventions. So we found studies that were reviewing things like group supervisory practices, so supervising a group of students not independently as is traditional, but making the supervisory experience a shared experience. Tools to enhance the supervisory relationship. So there was a study that looked at a kind of tool for aligning student and supervisor interests. So there's or understandings of the supervisory relationship, so greater transparency. So, and that underpins there a more effective working relationship. And then there were studies looking also at the kind of emotional support that a supervisor provides. So this is, I guess this is an area of support that you, if you're a supervisor or if you're being supervised, you might kind of expect, or you might expect to provide some kind of emotional support to your student, but it's often not something that is specified in your supervisory training. So important in this area are these kind of tools around facilitating communication, the ability to kind of actively review and manage that relationship, so tools that supported that, and some kind of emotional support if it was needed. And not all students necessarily feel that, and not all supervisors will feel comfortable with that. So that's maybe an practical issue that I'll come back to later on in the presentation. This area of psychological resources, as I say, they are overlapping. So having the resources to cope and to be resilient throughout your PhD, and this might be underpinned to some extent by a strong relationship with your supervisor, so you can see the overlap immediately between areas, or there might be more specific individualized interventions, training and coaching, and mental health support that the university provides, or it might be much more informal. So we had a number of studies that looked at how to sort of strengthen the PGR community, and also kind of digital means for developing PGR community, but also not just the community of PhD students, but there's also some studies that identified the role of family and friends in providing support for PhD students during their period of study as well. And as I say, I mentioned the supervisory relationships as well there. So within this, we had different studies. So we had studies that were testing a particular kind of training to support development of resilience. But we also had studies that were about showing how PGR community might provide psychological support and friendship that gives you resources that enable you to get through the period of study and succeed and flourish. This area might seem less connected to well-being, so personal and professional skills, so the sort of personal development of someone through their period of PGR study. But what we found was that the studies that identified this as being relevant to well-being also tended to forge a kind of sense of community within PGR students. They might provide mentoring and coaching opportunities outside of the PhD, outside of the supervisory relationship, which might be important. So there are examples of studies here, for example, that looked at mentoring programs for specific ethnic minorities who are underrepresented in academia. So there's a professional development and professional kind of coaching aspect to it, but also an important sense in which it addresses things like that kind of imposter syndrome, and perhaps not the sense you might not fit in within academia or within your department. And then there were sort of more tailored training opportunities that obviously if you have opportunities to develop your professional skills, then that feeds into that reduction of anxiety about your progress and your sense that you're progressing in your PhD. So it really sort of built kind of problem solving abilities and develop these competencies that allow you to flourish or to kind of deal with any setbacks. And then PGR community was quite important, and there was lots of different ways in which this might be built. As I said, it provided this kind of emotional support, so links to that psychological resources, but it's also a way in which PGR students can address problems as well. So you don't know how to submit an abstract for a particular society conference. How do I join the society? Students will rely on these online communities or these in-person communities to sort of problem solve issues like that, or having an issue with their supervisor. How do I change a supervisor? If you've got a kind of community around you where you can go and sort of seek some advice, and that's going to be helpful. So some of the things like the group training or the group supervision, so things which bring PGR students together, they might not necessarily be doing the same kind of topic, but it gives them support with these sort of more logistical or practical issues they might need. But also things like social media platforms, group projects, the organising of, for example, at MBS we have a PGR colloquium every year, and students within the school do a lot of the organising for that, and they might be doing very different things, but it helps them. It helps to build a sense of community. working on journal papers together, etc. So there might be lots of different ways in which the community is built, but this can be really effective in supporting well-being. So coming back to the model there, you can see that these areas, although we've kind of developed them from the findings of the review, you can see there's a real overlap between the different areas. And as I say, lots of in each area, there are kind of different ways in which those headings can be addressed. So psychological resources can be built by specific interventions, well-being interventions, but the more effective ways may be to actually have mentoring programs with current PGR students or with academics that are relevant to those PhD students, or through supervisory relationships. Likewise, community can be built in lots of different ways as well. So there's no kind of, and as I say, with the quality of the studies we picked up in the review, we wouldn't be able to categorically say this intervention is really effective or this practice is really effective, because the evidence, the strength of the evidence was quite limited. So we chose to try and synthesize the findings in this way because we thought that this was a more valuable way of trying to communicate the findings from the review. So in terms of implications and recommendations, and after this slide, I will hand over to John, who's going to talk through more about how we might address some of the barriers to putting these things into practice and following these recommendations. So number one is to facilitate that development of PGR community, and I suspect most universities and schools have this as a goal. But the key thing is to think about developing PGR community in a wide range of ways. So there may be sort of specific things out of habit or out of tradition that are done within a department as a way of developing community and trying to, like monthly seminars that PGR students have to come to. That might not necessarily be the most effective way of developing community. But this is something that institutions really should put effort and specific funding into. And it may need to be much more student-led to be effective, and that might not be the case at the moment. And this shouldn't supersede like digital tools and spaces for support. And possibly in the current climate, there's a danger we've moved too much to that kind of virtual forms of interaction support for PGR students who can often be very isolated. So there's a danger in pursuing the kind of virtual options and the digital options that you're kind of, or we're covering that, but these are effective. Definitely, we found examples of that within the review, but without the sort of material kind of sense of community, the in-person sense of community, that might leave some important gaps in supporting students. There is a need and there is a benefit for dedicated mental health support and preventative strategies, which might be things like resilience training, embedding aspects of wellbeing into professional development programs for PGR students. So as I said, it's not, although community and informal forms of support might be very important, it's not to say that universities don't need to have a designated mental health and wellbeing service that they offer to students. But this might not be something students necessarily take up. They might seek support through their family, or they might go through their family doctors, etc. Traditional health services, they might not want to access the university's services, but they should be there to provide support where needed, and also to develop this preventative strategy, so coping skills, etc. The supervisory relationship remains very important, but it may need to be considered in a new light, so not just around developing a student's professional abilities and supporting them through their program of research, but also considering maybe difficulties they might be facing, emotional difficulties or other difficulties, things like financial problems, for example. At the moment, as we're all keenly aware, we've got a huge energy crisis going on. I had a supervision with a PhD student last month, and we had a conversation then about, well, your stipend was set at a certain amount, and it wasn't based on the cost of living that we're now facing. So, and we had a conversation around whether that was problematic, or what support might be, how the stipend might be altered, etc. So these kind of things might not necessarily be the sort of thing that all supervisors are covering, and it might not be the sort of thing that all students need. but there's a need to reflect on how that relationship is effective or not. And then peer support and mentoring. And so this might be through students. So this might be students themselves providing peer support, or it might be academics, or people outside of the supervisory relationship. One thing to stress in terms of peer support is, although this can be very effective, this also can create a burden in itself, and the same can be said with the supervisory relationship. So universities, institutions need to be conscious of what they're asking of students in terms of providing support and supervisors. If there's an expectation that they are able to emotionally support students, are all supervisors comfortable with this? And if they're not, do they know how to refer a student to appropriate services? Do they know how to kind of identify issues, etc.? And do students want to take on the burden of peer mentoring and support? This might be a big demand on their time, and depending on the issues that another PhD student might experience, it might also be a more serious burden in terms of emotional toll. So if those sort of means of supporting PGR, mental health and wellbeing, are going to be developed, there needs to be a consideration of the people who are sort of providing the support, as well as those who may be benefiting from it. So that needs to be recognised and appropriate training delivered. So I think at that point, I'm going to hand over to John. So I will mute myself, and John, just let me know when you want me to move on the slides. Just one final thing I will mention before I hand over is, I mentioned that this presentation is based on a published paper. We do also have a short report that's a sort of lay summary of the review as well. So if that's helpful, again, let us know, and we're happy to share those. So I'll stop talking now and I'll hand over to John. And if you could just direct me, John, I'll move on the slides as needed.
All right, many thanks, Dave. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Good to speak to you and hopefully hear from you later on. So just a brief update about where we're going next. So I'm going to talk for about kind of 5 or maybe 10 more minutes, developing some of those things that Dave was starting to talk about just now, around some of the barriers to implementing some of these good practices. And then I think, Joe, we're going to have a short break, and then we'd like to invite you to do something a little bit more interactive, whereby we'll give you a chance in breakout groups to talk to each other, sharing stories about how some of these interventions, if you want to call them that, to support PGR wellbeing have actually fared in practice, and what some of the issues around those implementations have been. So if you have that in mind as we're talking and listening over the next few minutes, that would be great. So some of the things that Dave was talking about, good practices, understanding of how certain good practices can contribute positively to well-being and good mental health. There was a puzzle for me. I'm by background a political studies researcher. I'm interested in the way that knowledge and ideas are used within decision making, and the equation that you see at the screen in front of you there summarizes it quite nicely, because there are a lot of pieces of information about what works well. We have the review that Dave presented, lots of different interventions. Lots of people know, because we've disseminated a lot of these ideas over the last few years or so, what might work and what might work well. But the puzzle is that doesn't always necessarily lead to a transformation of practice. That doesn't necessarily also lead to a success when it comes to an intervention, or indeed a success when it comes to improving well-being. So this point below on the slide, wider research on translation of knowledge into policy. I thought it would be interesting to apply some of those ideas to the interventions that are being designed and disseminated on supporting PGR wellbeing. And Dave, could you put the slide on, please? I thought that it would be good to look at something which is quite well established within political science and policy studies, which is to look at different layers at which problems might arise within the way that ideas are deployed and used. So I'm just going to very briefly talk through what these are. So you might find that there are barriers to implementing some of these interventions, first at the individual level. So that's both individuals who are deciding and designing interventions, but also the individuals who are perhaps seen as the people who are going to be benefiting from particular interventions. So there's different barriers at this level. So that could be a kind of awareness barrier. That could be that people don't really know that there is a problem, or that they're not particularly experienced on understanding how a particular intervention might work. There might be some skepticism. People might know about some of the problems and the issues, but they might be quite skeptical about the value of certain types of intervention. They might be skeptical about the value of the so-called well-being agenda, full stop. There might also be barriers at the individual level when it comes to resources. So people might be aware and supportive, but there might be reasons why specific interventions aren't working quite so well. So that could be time, money, workload. There could be poor data availability on what problems are, what the impact of interventions might be. There might be gaps in skills and training and guidance, and Dave was expanding on some of those towards the end of his part of the presentation. The next level that you see is the organizational level, and so generally speaking, this focuses on how procedures and structures work. So different practices and ways of doing things within organizations. So that could include things like different fragmented practices across different parts of institutions. For example, the Students' Union might do things very differently to the graduate school. There might be different requirements across those different functions and different parts of the university. There might be different priorities. So admissions and recruitment priorities might be very different from the student support services priorities. There might be inadequate budget processes, so not just inadequate budgets, but the processes by which budgets get decided. They might not quite match up with the needs. There might be different types of intervention, different ideas about what interventions would work. People's work practices might not necessarily match up with the way that the new interventions are being designed. For example, if you've got a new initiative to support well-being that happens on a Monday morning, whereas most people's team meeting prior to that has been on a Wednesday afternoon, you might have a problem with different practices meeting up with each other. The third section is what I've called systemic, the kind of wider social and political context. So that's about values and ideas and norms and relationships between higher education institutions and other organizations. So that's at the very broad level, things like different societal values and priorities. So we see that already within each individual institution, but also those institutions operate within a wider context. So the context of universities requiring themselves to do lots and lots of different things, like maximizing student numbers, minimizing resource use, doing world-class research, financial survival. All of those things may not necessarily be pulling in the same direction, but there may be problems there. Different ideas of what well-being is and what causes of ill-being might be. There may be a sense among some people that that's caused mainly by individual lack of resilience. Among other people, it could be much more a social concept of the wider factors, the structural factors that might affect well-being. Different ways of understanding why well-being is a priority. So we might all agree that well-being initiatives are very good for and important for improving people's health and life experience, but maybe other people would see it as an opportunity to boost the influence of their particular organization or their particular stock within an organization. They might want to send a political signal. They might want to send a message to say, look, this is what I'm doing. There might be other motives available that drive what's behind some of these initiatives. And I think it's important to try to dig down into what those might be. There may also be interests, different interests. A particular intervention to support well-being might go directly against all sorts of different kinds of interests. They may not be explicitly expressed. It may not be seen as a good thing to express those things. So there may be a lot of hidden agendas going on that aren't entirely clear why some initiative is not necessarily progressing as well or as smoothly as it could. And there may be mismatched priorities between higher education institutions and other institutions. So there's a lot of work going on, for example, at the moment about work between higher education institutions and the National Health Service. And some of the challenges, the many challenges that there are in working across different bureaucracies with different agendas, different goals, different funding lines, etc. So they're just some of the barriers that might appear to these kinds of interventions. Could you put the next slide?